I think the notion of where threats are in our world today is different. The threats seem very external now in the real world. Terrorism, uh, threats to our economic survival, they're very global things. And so you need a character who plays on a global stage. And that's one of the reasons why we decided to go with Moscow, is because there's this sort of long-standing, I'd say, misunderstanding between the Russians and the Americans.
Partnerships are delicate, Mr. Ryan. Sometimes they end violently.
Part of the challenge was conveying the sense of what it really means to be Russian and the motivations for this character.
Victor's in love with an idea. He's in love with the ideology, the idea of Mother Russia and revenge.
He's a very powerful oligarch, and when invited to be part of a retaliation against the US when the Russians have been denied what they feel is their due at the United Nations, he then does something so awful, but he does so with a sense of sort of personal investment in it. He has a grudge against America.
It's that hatred from a young age that keeps growing until it's in subconscious.
He believes in what he's doing, you know, and you could argue, probably quite convincingly from his point of view, that he's doing the right thing.
So that sort of latent violence possibility gives quite an edge to the film.
It's not your traditional villain, it's a fresher approach to a villain. I grew up actually spending a lot of time in the Soviet Union, so I have a long perspective about it. You know, my father's a symphony conductor, and I went on, 10 tours with him in the Soviet Union. So I spent a lot of time as a kid behind the Iron Curtain. You know, my perspective then and my perspective now, it was as a kid, but fundamentally they don't seem all that different as people. They still have a very similar drive. What they're driving towards is different now.
The U.S.-Soviet relationship and now the Russian relationship was fraught with extreme danger, I think, during certain periods. My name is Jim Wirch. I'm Vice Chancellor for International Affairs here at Washington University in St. Louis. And by background, I'm a psychological anthropologist. I study psychology, especially psychology of national identity, in particular Russia and the U.S.
There's always been a rivalry at times and enmity between the United States and the Russian intelligence services. My name is Daniel Byman. I'm a professor at Georgetown University and the research director of the Saban Center Brookings. I work extensively on Middle East security with a focus on terrorism and U.S. policy.
In the main, I think you're talking about two peoples who feel that they have a commanding presence on the world stage, and inevitably they're going to bump. My name is Mike Halsall, and my field of expertise is international relations, especially European-American relations, and Russian and German history, which I used to teach.
Of course, the CIA was always present in the rest of the world too, but often through a lens of how does this impact the Cold War reality. I'm Graham Seagroves. I was with the CIA for over a decade, essentially being a link between the people collecting secret information and the people who need to analyze it or use it.
One of the greatest peacetime spy dramas in the nation's history reaches its climax as Julius Rosenberg and Morton Sobel, convicted of revealing atomic secrets to the Russians, enter the federal building in New York to hear their doom.
U.S.-Soviet relations were at the heart of the Cold War. I mean, it's a two superpower situation.
After World War II, which ended in 1945, the Soviets set about busily incorporating Eastern Europe into their sphere of influence using local communist parties and the Red Army. And pretty soon, as Winston Churchill said, an Iron Curtain has descended upon Europe. So Poland and Czechoslovakia was called then, and Hungary and Romania and Bulgaria, you know the whole story, East Germany, they were all inside the Iron Curtain. And Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, which were incorporated directly into the Soviet Union.
The whole idea was that the communist movement was something that came out of the Soviet Union, and its responsibility was to spread that in most places.
As wrong-headed and ineffectual as communism was, nonetheless, it was a philosophically coherent system I think wrong, that millions of people around the world believed in.
Do you, Ambassador Zorin, deny that the USSR has placed and is placing medium and intermediate range missiles and sites in Cuba?
You will have your answer in due course.
I'm prepared to wait for my answer until hell freezes over, if that's your decision.
The first almost 44 years of the CIA's existence was about the Soviet Union and communism generally.
And there, the dominant issue was the threat of nuclear attack and the broader issue of confrontation with the Soviet Union in Europe in particular, but really around the world.
Countering Soviet aggression would have been a phrase at the time.
So the intelligence community was structured to find information on one of the hardest things in the world, what's going on in a secretive, authoritarian country that's very good at hiding its secrets.
Gentlemen, the last 24 hours have seen some extraordinary Soviet naval activity. The first to sail was this ship called the Red October. It is designed to approach by stealth and to shower its target with multiple independent warheads with little or no warning before impact.
Goddamn things made to start a war.
We were locked into something called MAD, Mutual Assured Destruction, basically, with the Soviets.
We have to remember at one time there was something on the order of 70,000 nuclear weapons in the world, and they were almost exclusively held by the US and the Soviet Union.
The old Cold War expression was, we both have enough to make the rubble bounce. And that's still true.
During the Cold War, there were important milestones such as the Soviet successful launch of a satellite into space. The Cuban Missile Crisis showed the risk of accidental nuclear war and highlighted the issue of attention to the readiness and command and control of nuclear weapons.
Our goal is not the victory of might, but the vindication of right. Not peace at the expense of freedom, but both peace and freedom here in this hemisphere, and we hope around the world. God willing, that goal will be achieved.
During the 70s, there was a question on whether the Soviets were serious about détente. Would they be willing to make true concessions, or were they simply using any lull in hostilities to build up? During the 1980s, there was real fear that the Soviet Union was incredibly aggressive in the Third World and was trying to take over or subvert a range of U.S. allies.
Well, I mean, during the Cold War, we basically supported any country that didn't like the Russians, didn't like the Soviets.
And then the biggest change of all comes with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
You have initial euphoria with the Soviet Union gone, a real sense that the world is going to be brighter, that we're going to see a lot less conflict.
You may have heard the phrase peace dividend. So all across the US government, there was an effort to scale back spending on intelligence and to some extent on defense because the perception at the time was that our greatest threat had gone away.
We thought maybe this was going to settle things in the long run. It hasn't worked that way, of course.
Well, according to CNN, your Mr. Nesmeraz is making promises to rebuild the Russian Empire. That sounds pretty rash from where I sit. If I was sitting in Chechnya, I'd be even more worried.
You know, when you look at that transition moment, I don't know that our country was all that great at helping him through that transition moment. So I think if I was one of those guys, I'd sort of feel some of the same feeling of like, well, you could have really been there for us and you weren't.
That's, in a way, what's confusing to us. I thought we got over our dispute with communism. You're not communist anymore, you're anti-communist in some ways, but we still are fighting over things, or potentially fighting over things. And that's because on the surface it's completely different in many ways, but underlying there's still a kind of worldview that we need to appreciate in ourselves as well as in others to understand this relationship.
Mr. President, conventional wisdom would suggest that Nemerov is playing the traditional Russian role. The aggressive, flex your muscles, dare the world to stop you. But with all due respect, I don't think he is one.
You just gassed the capital of another country, Doctor. With all due respect, you're wrong.
This is something I've studied for some time. The Russian national narrative is a narrative about what I call expulsion of alien enemies. It's a story that's been repeated in their view again and again. They've seen invasions of Teutonic Knights, of Poles, of French of Germans and French again. They've seen a lot of what they perceive as invasions and deep threats to Russian civilization, sometimes almost existential threats. And then with the expulsion of those enemies, kind of going back to the stable state of having a great Russian civilization again. Problem with this is a lot of people say this is not really the way we understand Russian history. Rather, it's a history of expansion into surrounding areas, neighboring areas.
There was the East German workers' revolt in June of 1953. There was the Polish workers' uprising in 56, and then especially the Hungarian Revolution in October, early November of 56, all of which were put down by force by the Soviets. And of course, the Cuban Missile Crisis, I didn't mention that. That was the worst, of course, when we were, that close to war.
In many ways, what we saw then is a reflection of a longer standing kind of national narrative that guides the way Russians think about the world. And we have our own national narrative about how we view the world.
You Americans like to think of yourselves as direct. But I wonder if perhaps you are just rude.
You Russians think of yourselves as poets, but perhaps you're just touchy.
To show you one way that the Russian, and I would say it's Russian and not so much Soviet, but the Russian and American perspectives come into play, the national narrative, has a lot to do with what we call D-Day, what they call the Second Front. For them, it's offensive to talk about D-Day as if this, and you listen to us, we finally liberated Europe from fascism. You say, it helped, but actually, if you look at the facts, the Soviet forces had already moved almost 1,000 kilometers back west from where they'd been pushed at one point. They'd had Stalingrad, which many people take to be the turning point in the war. I think sometimes in the United States, we don't appreciate the level of loss that the Soviet Union had. Current figure is thought to be around 27 million people who died in the Soviet period. So 400,000 versus conservative figure, 20 million, means 50 Soviets died for every American. And that leaves a very deep impression, of course, unbelievable kind of trauma on people.
That's something we reference in the movie of you don't know what it's like to suffer. You don't know what it's like to go through the hardships they went through.
You think my son died for a game? You think I will let myself die for nothing? No, it is America that will soon know what it is to have nothing.
And probably the way Americans treated that moment was not really great. And if you were in that moment and you were on that side of the coin, that's not something you're going to forgive all that easily.
And so there's a huge resentment.
Comrades, this is your captain. Once more, we play our dangerous game against our old adversary, the American Navy. But today, the game is different. We have the advantage. It reminds me of the heady days of Sputnik and Yuri Gagarin, when the world trembled at the sound of our rockets. A great day, comrades. We sail into history.
It played into their existing national narrative of expulsion of foreign enemies, which they just demonstrated their ability to do again. It reinforces the story. Russia is on its own. It has to be its own exceptional spiritual center to defend itself because nobody else will in the long run. And that made them clearly of the opinion, look, we've just lost this number of people by being invaded. We have to have a buffer. We deserve to have territory that was used to invade us, but also to support us as we rebuild.
There certainly is a tendency towards feeling sort of inferior in some ways and compensating for it and feeling superior in others. I mean, I've noticed that. I'm certainly not the first person to say this.
It's just different starting points that are very deeply embedded. They see it automatically, we see it automatically, and we have a hard time understanding how could you ever think something different from the way I see it. If you ask Americans why we use the atomic bombs in Japan, basically all Americans who have much knowledge of this will say something like, well, it was to stop the war.
Joy is unconfined.
But if you talk to Russians, they say, you can't really believe that. You used the atomic bomb to intimidate the Soviet Union because you were afraid of expansion into places in Asia, but certainly into Europe. And this is total news to most Americans. But that's the way that these national narratives operate at a very deep, automatic level for them and for us.
Now, talk me through your very scary memo, but keep in mind I don't have your PhD.
I think there's a coordinated plot within Russia to collapse the dollar and crash the U.S. economy, and it'll be time to follow a terrorist attack on U.S. soil.
All right, let's say you're right. What's the aftermath?
They'll recover. We won't.
I don't think anybody feels that there's a danger of the Red Army coming through the Fulda Gap. I mean, this is not 1962, this is not 1948, it's nothing remotely close to that. The Fulda Gap is now part of a reunited democratic Germany anyway.
But it doesn't mean that Russia doesn't have the capacity to create huge issues for others. It's still possible to have some tripwires that could create real conflict and even armed conflict.
They are concerned about our anti-missile system. The Russians say it could be adapted to deprive them of a second strike capability.
It's pretty unlikely Russia would launch a terrorist attack on the United States. Now, might individuals want to try to make some money off the U.S. stock market if they can figure out a way to rip it off? Sure.
Торги в Нью-Йорке начались. Кредиторы неизбежно потребуют внесения гарантийного взноса. Мы продаем?
You know, I don't think anyone's feeling all that secure about our economy, and I don't think people feel that secure about the world economy. And there's something great about the interconnectivity, and there's something incredibly threatening about it. And that's where we explore that sort of juxtaposition.
Our request comes from my country's highest level, and it is respectfully denied from mine. Then we will regard this as an act of economic war.
There's no doubt the Russians and the Americans haven't agreed on a lot of things recently, Syria being the most recent.
Russia is seen as blocking U.S. efforts around the world, harboring defectors like Edward Snowden, as blocking U.S. efforts in Syria, and in general is seeming to delight at poking the United States.
There's a sense of authoritarianism that goes on there. You know, Putin is a strong, strong leader.
I think it's fair to say that there's been a lot of acrimony recently. It's largely because Putin, who had rotated off the prime minister, is not as favorably disposed towards the United States as his predecessor, who was a puppet more or less anyway, but be that as it may, personalities matter. And Mr. Putin is just a very difficult ex-KGB agent.
No. There are KGB people and there are non-KGB, but there's no such thing as a former KGB.
Spying, of course, goes on all the time. The Russians still spy on us, we still spy on them. We kicked out 10 spies about 2 or 3 years ago.
There's no question the Russian intelligence services are very good. They're very good, especially at human operations, and they're very good at counterintelligence, at protecting their own secrets and at penetrating other countries' intelligence systems.
Many Russians, especially ones in the political class, deeply resent the fact that they no longer are in control in East Central Europe. They're used to being great powers, and they can't. It's very difficult to be an ex-superpower.
There is this incredible influx of money around oil, and there's an incredible vibrancy to capitalism there that is different than our capitalism.
There's huge amounts of money in the hands of a very small number of people, which is where oligarchs come from, where corruption just follows that so naturally.
Look, the oligarchs were not Boy Scouts. I mean, these guys all profited tremendously from privatization. Don't forget, in this whole vast area, it was all state-run. And most of these folks got their starts by very cleverly buying up state assets at fire sale prices and going from there. And some of them used some pretty unsavory tactics. You know, as I said, not Boy Scouts.
Сорокин хочет видеть вас немедленно.
I think one of the bigger problems is it's not entirely clear whether it's Putin or some of the oligarchs who really controls all the levers of power in Russia today.
I think everybody feels like there's something about feeling like a puppet in today's world. Like, who is back there making those backdoor deals? And you often discover that you're right to think about it.
Понимаете, Кремль не может быть замешан. Любые силы, которые вы задействуете, должны быть самостоятельными.
Само собой. These, quote, little things get out of control sometimes. Then we're in a very dangerous position. You can strike a chord to this expulsion of alien enemies national narrative and immediately get a response that just unleashes things.
So it's not the Cold War. It's not a sense that war could happen within weeks or months, but rather just a sense that this is a country whose leadership would rather see the United States fail than succeed.
Today, Russia is not in the same place it was during the Soviet period. In retrospect, sometimes we look back and say, yeah, that was more stable then. We knew who the actors were. We knew it was the Soviet government, the US government. We didn't have to worry about all these non-state actors, these oligarchs, people we don't even know who they are. I don't know which I would choose, but it's a different, to be sure, it's a different kind of threat today, that things could blow up in our face in small ways at first, but then with miscalculation goes down a chain reaction in ways that we can't control. And once we get locked into that with our perceptions based on this kind of cultural DNA that has completely different readings of the world, we're back to something that could be very dangerous.